Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Today's musing is about Mormon women being silenced, or perhaps better put, silencing themselves, or perhaps inheriting a culture in which silence on the moral, big, deep questions of our day is critical. I'm not the only one to consider that women's voices on those moral questions are important. Let's go to a brief remark that President Nelson made in 2015.
Let me add that we need women who know how to make important things happen by their faith and who are courageous defenders of morality and families in a sin-sick world.
Courageous defenders of morality and families in a sin-sick world. I could not agree with him more on this point. We need those women. Of course, we need men similarly. Just a few weeks ago, I did a musing on my new book called Rise Up, a call to action for men of God. You can find at socialharmony.org, which has all of my different religious books for you to check out there, or you can go find it on Amazon. So ringing the alarm for the men, absolutely. Men need to rise up. But here, President Nelson talking about the women. And that's what we're going to focus on today, particularly around a topic that one would hope and expect women would be rising up to be the leading prominent voices of. And what I'm going to share with you is some data that alarmingly, in my estimation, suggests that the opposite is happening. Now, this question of Mormon women standing up, female members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which does not sound nearly as good. In the early days of the church, this was not uncommon, from the founding of the Relief Society in 1842, for decades after that. Mormon women would use organizational platforms, hold mass meetings, write in newspapers or start newspapers, public speeches. They would denounce immorality, defend religious freedom, advocate for social reform. These women, many of these women during that era would condemn adultery and fornication, abortion, sexual exploitation, intemperance, even government tyranny. This is mostly in the context of polygamy, which I'll briefly get into. Speaking to audiences sometimes of thousands of people, publishing their views across the country. This was also interesting that the early female members of the church were doing this because Victorian society expected women to remain silent on controversial topics. But many Mormon women, by contrast, claimed religious authority to speak publicly on moral matters, viewing themselves more as essential partners in building God's kingdom on earth. Think of Emma. In 1830, in a revelation that we now have recorded in section 25 of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 25, verse 7, she is empowered to, quote, expound scriptures and to exhort the church. That's interesting, alongside her husband, and then by implication, the presidents of the Female Relief Society that followed. Emma was unequivocal that the Relief Society had more to do, she said, other duties to attend to than seeing to the wants of the poor. Specifically, among other things, rooting out immorality. She exhorted members of the Relief Society to repent, to forsake their sins, warning that Satan's forces were against this church. Among other things, that took place in the 1842 Relief Society document, unanimously voted by members of the Relief Society, called The Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo. This was a public declaration that condemned fornication and polygamy. It affirmed that the saints were focused on monogamy and chastity only. It framed all the rumors of spiritual wifery as slander, insisting that church members who practiced sexual misconduct or plural relationships should be cut off from fellowship. This was done under Joseph's direction and with his involvement and consent. This was part of the effort during his lifetime to root out all of this stuff happening behind the scenes where people were claiming Joseph was involved. This was an aggressive public stance against sexual immorality writ large. Eliza R. Snow, right? Another kind of firecracker early Mormon woman. She commented on a number of issues. For example, suffrage, and she took a contrasting position against another woman we'll shortly consider, but she was very outspoken. And she says, and I'll read the quote here for us to go over this. So Eliza R. Snow said, how how very different our position from that of our sisters in the world at large, and how widely different our feelings and prospects from that class known as strong-minded, who are strenuously and unflinchingly advocating women's rights. Not that we're opposed to women's suffrage, but to think of a war of sexes, which the women's rights movement would inevitably inaugurate, creates an involuntary shudder. So she's talking here in the context of female agitators who are demanding the right to vote and demanding more autonomy, and she took more of the position of deference to priesthood authority and direction by the men. So still supportive of suffrage and women having the right to vote, but not doing it in this bombastic, combative, strenuous way that the so-called, how did she put it, strong-minded women of the day were doing. Then you've got, for example, from 1872 to 1914, you've got Emmeline Wells, who publishes the Woman's Exponent. So this is a newspaper that was their primary platform for, moral and social advocacy, condemning adultery and sexual immorality, advocating for temperance and the word of wisdom, promoting women's suffrage as well, and political engagement, challenging degrading portrayals of Mormon women, teaching gospel principles, and yes, defending polygamy as morally superior to monogamy, taking the Brigham line and, the leading women of the day to have access to power and a voice and a platform, very much were subordinated to that viewpoint and therefore became advocates, even though many women were privately suffering and in their journals and in private company were talking about how awful, polygamy was for that vast majority of them. Here's a quote from Emmeline Wales, 1902. She said, "The inspiring influences that have been causing this uplifting of women, in the context of suffrage, are all in the program marked out for the children of our Father in heaven. Let those who dare deny it. But as sure as the scriptures are true, and they are true, so sure woman must be instrumental in bringing about the restoration of that equality which existed when the world was created. Perfect equality then, and so it must be when all things are restored as they were in the beginning." So again, this is she takes a different approach from Eliza R. Snow, who was more deferential. Emmeline Wales is more of, open to agitation and saying women have to lead out on this. So you've got suffrage in the mix. You've got polygamy, as I mentioned. So there was this federal bill that was proposed called the Colon Bill, and it said that anyone believing in polygamy would be denied the right to vote. So now it's mixing in the polygamy issue, which is, of course, hot in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, with the suffrage issue. And women are kind of Mormon women are at the crux of both. And so Sarah Kimball was one of many women who were deciding, what do we do about this? And what are we going to do about this federal bill that would deprive them of the right to vote if they even believed in polygamy, let alone practice it, would also deny them the ability to serve on a jury. Sarah Kimball said, "Mormon women would be unworthy of the names we bear or of the blood in our veins should we longer remain silent." And so she and a bunch of other women, in fact, I think thousands of women, January of 1870, organized themselves into what is now called the Great Indignation Meeting. And this was basically a big venting session where they were showing, it was all women except for some male reporters apparently, and they were just saying, we're not oppressed and polygamy's fine. And so again, these are kind of the ones who had access to power and were towing the line. But the point is they were outspoken. That is my point. Whether we're talking about morality or adultery or the word of wisdom or suffrage or even polygamy, depending on your perspective, there was an outspokenness by many of the leading women of the church in the early days of the church. Today, by contrast, female church leaders are silent. If they speak, it's on superficial topics and with a primary voice. And that's not to say there haven't been some great addresses in general conference from women of the church. I'm not aiming to kind of, write off every single female leader the church has spoken. My point rather is to say that there is a profound silence on one of the most pernicious evils. One might argue it is the most pernicious evil that plagues our current society. And I'm talking about abortion. I will get in just a moment into the data, which I think and I hope should shock you in how silent women of the church have been on this question. Okay, so some brief statistics before we go over the data. An estimated 73 million induced abortions take place around the world each year. That equates to roughly 200,000 per day. Now, of course, this is just based on available data. For all we know, this number could even be greater. Someone's just, taking matters into their own hands and so forth. But 200,000 human lives being terminated every single day. Nearly 1/3 of all pregnancies end in abortion. 1/3 of this generation is being snuffed out. For all the concern that the Elons and others of the world, myself included, about a lowering population replacement rate, that people are having fewer and fewer kids. Well, not only is there less marriage and less sex and less testosterone and, and all those things, there's also, after successful conception, 1/3 of the lives are being just exterminated. If abortion stopped overnight, the population replacement level would, or the fertility rate rather, would skyrocket. In the United States, it's around 1/5 of abortions for every 1,000 live births. About 200 abortions for every 1,000 live births. Pernicious evil. Like, how can anyone think it's anything but? And of course, then the pro-choice so-called crowd, oh, but what about in cases of rape, and what about incest? And they're always using the 0.1% instance to justify the 99% of convenience and for financial reasons, or I'm too busy, or it's gonna harm my career, or whatever, right? So I wanted to dig into the data and really try and understand this question. There's no data set out there, I think, that exists at all to show men in the church, particularly in general conference, male leaders of the church commenting on particular topics versus female leaders of the church. And so I built a tool that I'm going to show you. I say I built it. I had my little Claude Code AI bot build this all, and downloaded all the general conference talks since 1971 when there's a data set from the church, poured over all of it, created an analysis to produce the results that I'm going to show you. Now, the talks start from 1971 on, which is the data set from the church. That's also a fairly convenient date because that tracks fairly well with when abortion gets really hot and heavy into the cultural zeitgeist. 1 year prior is when Jane Roe, from Roe v. Wade, this is a pseudonym for Norma McCorvey was the woman's name. So Jane Roe in March of 1970 files a federal lawsuit in Texas challenging the constitutionality of Texas's abortion laws, arguing that it violates her right to privacy, etc. In her case, Norma carried her child to term, placed the baby for adoption. Interestingly, 25 years later, in 1995, she converts to Christianity. She ends up joining the anti-abortion movement, says that her role in this lawsuit was the biggest mistake of her life. Someone else had been organizing the lawsuit, and they were just soliciting a plaintiff. So it's not like she was driving the whole thing. She was just a pawn in someone else's chess game. A few months later, a 3-judge federal district court panel ruled in favor of Jane Roe, holding that the Texas abortion statutes were unconstitutional because they infringed on a woman's fundamental right to choose whether to have children, grounded in the right to privacy. Of course, reading in the Constitution something that didn't exist. But the district court declined to issue an injunction, which would have stopped enforcement of the law. So the statutes were still on the books. The laws, they had been rendered or declared unconstitutional, right? But this was all done in a way to just push the case towards review by the Supreme Court. So in 1971, which again is when our data set begins for the General Conference talks, both sides of this court case appeal. The U.S. Supreme Court agrees to hear Roe v. Wade. It's argued for the first time on December 13th, 1971. And so throughout 1971, there's a lot of stuff in the news, a lot of chatter about this. People are getting ready with anticipation for this court case. It's then decided, I can't remember, months or like a year and a half later. It might have been in 73. But the point is 1971 for this data set is really interesting for us to start to look at when abortion is like really hot and heavy in the cultural zeitgeist, what people are thinking about and worried about. Okay. Let us then look at the data. I will explain this for the many of you who only listen to the audio version of the podcast. What you're looking at here is an analysis from 1971 onward of the number of times that abortion has been discussed in General Conference. Again, keep in mind 1/3 of God's children being exterminated, right? Massive, massive issue. One that perhaps has been normalized, and yet here we are. So what we're looking at right now, starting from 1971 moving forward, is the number of overall total mentions. And what you can see is that there's a lot of chatter throughout the 70s, and rightly so, because Roe v. Wade is just really huge in the news. It really starts to lower in the 1980s and throughout the 1990s. You get basically nothing in the early 2000s and a tiny little smattering in the 2000s and 10s, and then in the past few years. Now, for the observant, you'll see that there's a key. We've got men and women, and you will see a ton of blue and a little bit of pink. And the reasonable person would say, well, of course, that's because there's far more male leaders of the church than there are female leaders of the church. So it stands to reason that you're going to have way more commentary from male leaders of the church than female leaders of the church. Duh. How is this, shocking at all? Well, on its surface, it's not. But when you peel back the layer and look at the percentages, that's when it gets very interesting. But first, let's slice the data a little bit differently. For now, here this is showing just the men. Now, again, for those of you not looking at the video, nothing really changed. The pattern that I just described is basically what it still is, because the vast majority of mentions come from men of the church. Now, however, let's look at only the women. And what you see is an appalling, disgusting, shocking, profound silence. Again, not again. For those who can't see this, we've got 2 mentions in 1978, and we've got one in 1992. If I scroll down here, I can see the matching talks. So in 1978, we had Barbara Smith, Ruth Funk, and then in 1992, we had Virginia Pierce. These are the only mentions. By the way, I should point out, I'm searching for abortion, abort, as in like abort the baby or abort the fetus or whatever, life, like the sanctity of life or protecting life in the context of an abortion. So I'm searching for like related terms here that would reference abortion. So I'm not just only looking, that's what's critical for me to convey. This is not just, but the women tend to refer to it as the sanctity of life, or we need to protect the fetus in the womb. Like I'm searching for a bunch of stuff. And yet we have 3 mentions from female leaders of the church in the past half of a century, more than half of a century. Now, this is still looking at the data, including all mentions, even superficial, one-off, tiny little references before they move on. So let's go back to all genders. And so again, you see the men and women together, but this is looking at all mentions, both the substantive, by which I mean the talk is about this topic, or several paragraphs are spent talking about this topic. It's a meaty, exposition and treatment of that issue. That is what I would consider substantive. Superficial is like, the moral evils of our day, such as, abortion and war and pornography and blah, blah, blah. That would be more superficial because, sure, it's mentioned, but it's not substantive. So let's strip out all of the non-substantive for all genders. Let's actually just start with the men. And let's look at just the substantive. So again, you're looking at a lot in the 70s, medium in the 80s and 90s, and basically near silence ever since. I did a musing on this, a couple years ago. I'll link to that in the show notes for this page for those who want to reference that later on and see where I dig into some of the data around this. Not so much around the gender and some of the stuff that I'm sharing here, but that is in a separate musing that I'll link to in the YouTube description. Okay, so we're looking at all mentions. When I strip away all the superficial and we focus just on the substantive, this is what we have. We still have, more in the 70s than at any other time. And then we've got like a tiny handful of mentions in the 80s, a tiny handful of mentions in the 90s, none in the 2000s, a tiny handful, 2 in the 2010s and 2 so far in the 2020s. So if I scroll down here, you'll see, we've got 20 matching talks throughout this entire time. This is from the men. These are substantive addresses. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the percentages here. So we found 20 matching talks from men, substantive talks since 1971 on the topic of abortion. If you look at them as a percentage of the whole, right, taking how many substantive talks there are on abortion relative to the overall number of talks given by men, it's 0.54%. Okay, 0.5, so half of 1%. Now, if I flip it back to all mentions, it goes to 2.83%. But again, like it's, hey, I'm talking about the importance of, virtue, and I say the word abortion once in the context of, 1,200 words or however long a talk is. Big whoop, kind of like, yay, it got a mention, but it's not being tackled head on, right? So I think it's interesting to strip away all the superficial. Let's look just at the substantive. And for that, we've got half of 1%. That's looking at, again, just the men. If we go over to the women, I'll toggle really quick back to all mentions. We'll go to the women. Again, here's our 3 talks. We have 3 talks from women, mothers, people who have born children, people whose role it is to be an exemplar and a role model and to support women and to nurture and to, promote humanity and the bearing of children and God's design for motherhood and all of this stuff. We have 3 mentions from women since 1971, over 50 years. How many of them were substantive? Any thoughts? Any guesses? We've got 3 total talks. How many of those 3 do you think are substantive? The answer is 0. Not one of them. And so we go from 0.5% for men to 0% for women. If we go to all mentions and I go back to men, again, we've got 2.83% of total talks. At least get a superficial mention of abortion, if not something more meaty. If I go to women, it's 0.76%. This is including all the superficial stuff, including just the tiny little offhand references. So now we can dispel the notion, oh, well, women talk in conference less. No, we're looking just on a percentage basis compared to just the women talking. Forget how often they've talked. Forget how often they talk compared to men. We're now just looking at men to women. So again, men at least have mentioned the word abortion or the issue or whatever in 2.83% of their talks. Look, that's not necessarily unreasonable. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. There's a lot of issues to cover. Granted, this is like something killing 1/3 of God's children. You would think that it would get more attention than it does. Perhaps the issue is that things have been just too normalized and therefore we move on and whatever. But 2.83% of talks by male leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in General Conference, 2.83% of them talk about or mention the word abortion. And if we go over to women, it is 0.76%. That is 1/4 of the rate of men. Men are 4 times more likely to at least mention the word abortion than women in General Conference. Why? One would think it would be the opposite. One would expect that women would be champions of this issue, would be like Emma Smith in putting out the Voice of Innocence. Imagine the Voice of Innocence 2.0 by the Relief Society condemning elective abortion, talking about the need to rally resources to help support women in need who are going through crisis, who feel alone, who feel like they can't financially support a child. What if we had the manifesto of the Relief Society in 2026 to be for the voice of the innocent children and to rally women around the world to be champions of the cause of the unborn children of God who are being snuffed out en masse? And yet, since 1971 at least, and I believe prior, because though this data set doesn't show before 1971, I have other data access on websites and things, and I'm poking around and like, I think women talked a lot less, back then too. In the early days of the church, they call it feticide, like fetus, the killing of a fetus, or sometimes infanticide. So there's some mentions from early male leaders of the church to feticide, but effectively no women. Please prove me wrong pre-1971. I did not do an exhaustive review before 1971. There might be, maybe. a female leader of the church who had occasion to speak in general conference before then who dedicated her topic to this, I'm deeply, deeply skeptical. I strongly now believe, from the clear data that I have 1971 going forward, as well as the searching that I was doing prior, that effectively no female leader of the church has condemned the snuffing out of 1/3 of God's children. Now, the Book of Mormon, there was an interesting book my mom introduced to me called, I think it was called Ripened. And it made, I think I've mentioned this once before and I'm using it. It makes the case that when you read the Book of Mormon and it's talking about secret murder, that is a reference to abortion. So if you go back and you read the Book of Mormon, it talks about like the secret combinations and they're doing all these murders, but then it talks about how they're also doing these secret murders. And the author of the book kind of makes the case, like, why would they distinguish between the two? Because they're also murdering in secret. They're killing, the chief judge or whatever, right? And so why make a distinction between the two? Why say that the secret combinations are both murdering in secret, but also engaged in acts of secret murder? The manner in which they're being described is different. It's not just, there's, two different ways of saying the same thing. No, it's very different. So it appears that the Book of Mormon is, condemning the blood spilling from the innocent, is crying up unto God and so forth, right? And yeah. Anyways, it's alarming. Look at that. Let's look at the three mentions let's at least like give them the justice of seeing what they actually said. So here again are the three mentions. And if I go down here, I can see the talks. Let's start at the bottom, go back to 1978. So here's Barbara Smith, and I could play the little clip if you want, but here's what she says. On matters of morality, he, President Kimball, has given more specific counsel. On such issues as abortion, the Equal Rights Amendment, homosexuality, and pornography, he has given direct counsel. So again, like just a passing reference on a bunch of stuff, right? Ruth Funk, come listen to a prophet's voice. Medical experts advised us there were two alternatives, my probable death or therapeutic abortion of the child growing within me. Right? So just in context to this experience and a brief reference to a personal experience. Here's a talk on fear by Virginia Pierce in 1992, first counselor in the Young Women General Presidency. And she's saying, I've asked many young women what they're afraid of. These are some of the things that they told me. One of which is, I've made some terrible mistakes, bringing shame, embarrassment. I was so afraid of the humiliation that I thought about having an abortion. So this is in the context of like a dozen different things that young women have told her. So again, it's not a talk on abortion. It's just this long list of different topics, and abortion gets one mention. Okay. So again, stressing the point, no female leader of the church, at least since 1971, and I believe ever, has substantively addressed and criticized and rebuked the modern death machinery that is the abortion industry, the death cult that has been so normalized. This is what's killing most human beings, and there's not a peep from the female leaders of the church. What example does that set to up-and-coming young women? I think it opens the door for cultural acceptability of being so-called pro-choice. I can be a good member of the church and support 1/3 of God's children being snuffed out. Female leaders of the church are talking about virtues of motherhood. That is not uncommon to hear them talk about. But are we really advancing this ideal if we don't talk about avoiding this dark, pervasive trend by which mothers are killing their babies? It's like the Book of Mormon, right? Yes, it's another testament of Jesus Christ. Yes, we should focus on all the positive, happy-go-lucky teachings and everything, 100%. But it's also a warning manual. It's full of specific, applicable warnings. And if you ignore all the bad stuff because, it gives me the ick, I don't want to think about secret combinations, I don't want to think about bad people doing bad, evil things, right? You're missing the point. Thus, in 1832, the saints becoming condemned because they were treating lightly the things that they had received. Think about that. You're treating it lightly. You're lightly, superficially touching on just the positive stuff rather than substantively engaging with it. The Lord wanted the saints to substantively engage with the Book of Mormon, not just as a treat it lightly and it's happy-go-lucky, positive spiritual stuff. Absolutely, that too. But to substantively tackle the weightier matters of the law that it talks about and that it teaches about and that it warns about. I think the same is with female leaders of the church today. Talk about the virtues of motherhood all you want and the importance of, being loving and kind and educating your children and speaking in a soft voice to love and nurture them. 100%. Do the light things about motherhood. But let's talk about what, this dark, pervasive trend by which mothers are killing their babies. Let's talk about the attacks on motherhood, the cultural trends of social and personal convenience, of like, oh, I want a profession, I want to go work in a cubicle managing spreadsheets, so I'm going to kill my baby so I can, earn a little more money. And like, let's talk about what is deterring young women from engaging in the ennobling, eternally important act of motherhood. What are those cultural and social threats? If we don't talk about the bad, even if it gives us the ick, then we're treating lightly the topic of motherhood, just like the saints were treating lightly and are treating lightly the Book of Mormon. We have to talk about the threats. I talk about this again and again and again. You will lose every battle that you don't know is being fought. And if we don't realize Satan's tactics, if we don't realize what the adversary is trying to do to divert young women from becoming mothers and bringing more of God's spirit children to this earth to have their moral experience, if we don't understand those threats, then we fall prey to them. Our children fall prey to them. We become buffeted about with every wind of doctrine, like we're at sea, we're adrift, we're not anchored on the foundation of Christ because we've embraced the Babylonian winds that fill our sails so easily. What we see all over social media, our young women, my daughter, her friends, all young women are being bombarded with all of these voices and false doctrines. So we can't just talk about the virtues of motherhood with our little primary voice in general conference. We have to talk clearly about the threats to motherhood today. Why young women are being seduced away from this fundamental, important role. Why fertility is declining. Why family formation is under threat. Why the normalized convenience of reproductive health care is garbage. It is evil. Leaders have been silenced. I talked about this in the musing whenever that was a couple of years ago too, but in this particular context, women, female leaders have been silenced. They've silenced themselves. They should have the loudest voices. There should be, maybe I had to suggest this to my mom or somebody, we need to do a Voice of Innocence 2.0. Someone get the General Relief Society presidency on the call, and this thing ought to be done. Women should take a bold stand around this topic. But I think members have grown used to the sin. They've grown complacent. Abortion's been normalized. They're weak. Now we have just nice women speaking with soft primary voices. They've been neutered, subdued, trained. And so what? Is any of this acceptable? By the way, I haven't opined on anything political. I don't know that I necessarily agree that the state should come in and, chain mothers up in prison if they decide to abort their babies. There's different political strategies to deal with this. There's different incentives. But man, if our pulpits are not being pounded with this from a moral perspective, forget about any type of solution. Forget about any discussion about the right way to actually enforce this, whether we do equate it to murder, on what basis we do hold mothers accountable for terminating the lives that they've consented to conceive by engaging consensually in sexual intercourse. Talk later about the repercussions and the punishments and the consequences and the incentives. None of that, which is all downstream, is going to materialize if we don't have a cultural and spiritual revolution around this topic. If the pulpits are not being pounded with passionate leaders, but especially women who are standing up for the voice of the truly innocent. And it's just not happening. That is what the data shows. Zero women in the church, leaders of the church, in Relief Society, in young women, have opined on this topic in any substantive fashion at all, ever. that was mind-boggling. I had some theories going into this musing of like, well, yeah, of course, we had a bunch of men talk about it, including substantively, far more superficially, but man, we've had a bunch of men, and sure, as a percentage, whatever, it's 2.8% or whatever it was. So surely around 2.8%, if not more, of women have substantively talked about the issue, because these are women after all, right? Talking about motherhood and children and their divine role in God's plan. So surely there's got to be a handful. And so when I pulled it up and it just showed 3 women total, including superficial, I was like, oh crap. I think the data is going to reveal something different. And then I toggled it from substantive or from all the results to only show the substantive. It was 0. Oh, wow. That was a revelation. A depressing one. I hope it changes. It needs to change. 200,000 of God's children every single day. Now, look, I don't know the doctrine, and I don't think any of us do well enough to say, like, can God repurpose spirits? So if someone does abort their child, is that like permanent? Or how old does the child have to be before it just, well, you go back to the spirit world? Or is it like any baby preconception because you didn't actually I don't know that, right? It could be that God has a reasonable solution because he knew that his children would widely engage in these acts of secret murder and try to just terminate their own lives and kill their own flesh. In order to get away with sexual promiscuity and not suffer the consequences and so forth. So it could be that God has a masterful solution that allows those spirit children to still come down into a body, created by a family that will actually love them and not kill them. So maybe in an eternal sense, this is okay. And yet the spiritual consequence of killing your own child, like, even if that baby can be spiritually, reallocated, that is still the act of murder. And so regardless of the child's status, which I just don't know, man, that is just creating a profound toleration and normalization of a moral evil that has been culturally and legally sanctioned and swept under the rug and not commented about by any female leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I will leave it there. I'm curious in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. What does this mean to you? What should it mean to all of us? Where do we go from here? Is it up to the men to speak out for all of the babies and the moms who remain silent? Why is it that, is it because of, I won't speculate why women leaders of the church have just gone to their primary voice and lightly talking about topics rather than, Emma Smith and Eliza Snow and Emmeline Wells and all these women who are more kind of rabble-rousers. Who knows? I have my theories, but they're kind of beside the point for this musing. But I'm curious about yours. So let me know in the comments what you think. Hope you enjoyed this particular musing, depressing though it was, and I will see you next week.